Howdy, welcome to Our Earth Rising, a podcast by students and faculty from Texas A&M University. Our podcast aims to spotlight each of our planet's ecospheres, from the biosphere to the cryosphere, and to discuss the complicated, challenging, or wicked environmental problems found in today's globalized society. Each new episode will be entirely dedicated to highlighting a complex problem within one of our ecospheres. We will facilitate conversations with global experts and Texas A&M faculty from all across campus. The purpose of our podcast is to highlight the importance of engaging in interdisciplinary research, recognizing diverse perspectives, and promoting equitable outcomes, which are all necessary factors for identifying peaceful and sustainable solutions to global environmental challenges. We hope you join us on this journey that will take us from the distant past to the far future, and from the depths of the Earth's crust to the skies above.
Instead of jumping right into the first ecosphere, however, the topic for our first episode will be about a more overarching concept to help put the following episodes into perspective. We are unofficially, as of right now, within a new chronostratigraphic epoch called the Anthropocene. Yes, I promise we did not make any of those words up, but it is important to learn about them nevertheless. In this episode, we will explain what the Anthropocene is, what has been leading up to it, aspects of living within the Anthropocene, and what us present-day humans should be thinking and doing amid anthropogenic change currently taking place on Earth today. To help us, we have invited a couple of professors who research how humans, both past and present, can impact and shape the environment. With that, let the rising begin.
The Anthropocene is considered by geologists to be the current geological age during which human activity has been considered the most dominant influence on our planet's climate and environment. The term originates from the combination of the ancient Greek words anthropos, meaning human, and kainos, meaning new or recent. The Anthropocene, which became recognized as an informal epoch in 2016, is characterized by dramatic mass extinctions and accelerated climate change due to widespread convergence of forest and other natural areas into agricultural and urban land. While there is still some debate about when exactly it started, most scientists agree on the year 1950, when nuclear weapon detonation and persistent industrial chemicals became widespread and pervasive enough to leave a clear and traceable signal or marker on the geological record. Regardless of when the Anthropocene is thought to have begun, humans have inarguably become major drivers of change in the natural environment ever since we began the lethal pairing of hunting and burning 50,000 years ago. Knowing how to define the geological epochs that make up the larger geological timescale is crucial in understanding the profound relationships and effects that have transpired thus far in our Earth's history. Substantial physical changes, such as evidence in the rock strata and the makeup of fossils, can be used to characterize specific geological time periods. Factors such as mass extinction, changes in sea level, ocean chemistry, and rapid changes in climate patterns are all major biological shifts that can't hide from the fossil record. We will now begin our conversation concerning these natural historical records with Dr. Heather Thakar, an assistant professor and curator of research collections for the Department of Anthropology at Texas A&M University. Dr. Thakar, could you describe the concept of defining geological time in layman's terms for us?
Well, the way that I like to think about it, right, everything about defining geologic epochs means we're looking back. We are looking into the Earth itself for some signal of things that have happened in the past. So we define geologic epochs based on things that represent a clear break in the way geologic forces acted on the Earth from one period to the next. So we can look at, this is going beyond a geologic period, but like the Cambrian era. Looking back, it's defined by an explosion in life, an incredible amount of biodiversity, and it is remarkable and it's distinguished because we didn't see that in earlier eras, and it is something that makes it different from later eras. So it has to be something that is detectable looking into the Earth itself and its history. So it's tied to both what happened in terms of geologic processes, but also our ability to detect what happened.
Now, exactly what evidence could one look at when defining the beginning of a geological epoch such as the Anthropocene?
If an alien race landed on Earth 5 million years from now, and they were looking to define what had happened in Earth's history, they would see at this moment in time that we're talking about a massive extinction, a huge shift from an incredible amount of biodiversity to 95% of Earth's life being 5 species: humans, chickens, cows, the things that we like to eat, and 5% of life being what might be considered wild or natural fauna. So that huge shift, not only in the diversity of life, but also sort of the very narrow focus specialization of life that happens at this moment in time. And to not beat around the bush, we have to be clear that it is a human-driven change. And it's that human-driven change that's fundamental to the definition of an Anthropocene.
Although the beginning of the Anthropocene epoch is commonly accepted as the 1950s, the changing relationship between humans and the natural environment began much earlier than that. This has brought about the idea of a potential Paleo-Anthropocene. Dr. Thakar, could you discuss your research on humans' relationship with the environment dating back to pre-Columbian times?
Sure. I'm glad to share. I am an anthropological archaeologist. So what that means is that I, as an archaeologist, look at the human past, and I try to better understand not only what humans did, but the larger cultural implications and the relationships with the environment that those people had. So my research is mostly in the Americas, off the coast of California on the California Channel Islands. Sometimes they're called the Galapagos in North America. And then I also work down along the coast of Central America. So I most of the time focus on foraging societies, so groups of people who make their living harvesting plants and animals from the environment. So this is actually the state that humans have lived in as a species for about 99% of our history. Very small mobile groups based on families that would move around frequently in response to changes in food and the environment. So I look at foraging societies, but at the brink of doing something very different. So on the California Channel Islands, we have foragers who develop sedentary communities, and they see really huge rates of demographic increase. That's weird for a foraging society. In Central America, I'm looking at foraging societies that begin to domesticate plants and slowly shift towards more intensive agriculture. Eventually, the scale of agriculture that supports, the Mayan Empire. But looking at that very early adoption of cultivated plants and the relationships between humans and the environment, the accumulated impacts of those relationships, and sort of that long-term trajectory.
Is there any research you are conducting that looks at past human impacts on the environment?
So right now I have a project in Nicaragua, and that project is built around looking at human impacts to the forests in the highland landscape. So humans do come into Central America probably around 14,000 years ago. We still don't have evidence of their very first occupation in the region, but we do know that it was sometime at the end of the Pleistocene based on sort of the global record of human migrations. So when people are first coming into this neotropical forest landscape, what are they doing? And how is that impacting the vegetation. One of the things that we know they were doing in other parts is cutting and burning. And especially as they begin to use more cultigens, so plants that humans have become important in shaping their future reproductive success. So once humans begin to manage that forested landscape, cutting down trees that are not useful, caring for trees that are useful, perhaps beginning to plant some seeds and get rid of others. Once they start doing that, we want to look at the downstream effects of that landscape change. So, do we have an increased sediment load going into the rivers? One hypothesis is that once we have increased slash and burn or landscape management things happening in the mountainous regions of Nicaragua, then we have that increased sediment load transport going down to the coast. That increases progradation of the coast and growth of the mangrove habitat.
So we know humans have been shaping the landscape of Earth for thousands of years. Could you give your thoughts on whether the concept of a Paleo-Anthropocene is viable?
First, are we in the Anthropocene? Absolutely. I don't think that is the current debate. Scientists are arguing about when we should say the Anthropocene begins. And archaeologists like myself have drawn attention to the fact that people have had significant impacts on the earth for as long as we have been here. So humans, everywhere we have gone, every landscape we have inhabited, we have been significant drivers of what has happened in those environments. We are the ultimate niche constructors. We walk into a savanna, cross it, and one of my favorite ethnographic stories of an anthropologist following around a forager in Aboriginal Australia is that they walk all the way across the savanna and the man turns around and sets it on fire. And the anthropologist says, well, what did you do that for? And he said, well, it's going to be so much easier when we go back if we don't have to walk through all this grass. Humans do that. We are shaping our environment in ways that make our lives easier. And anytime a human population has moved into a landscape, they have begun to shape it in ways that are favorable for themselves. And it could be as simple as moving into the neotropics of Central America and choosing the fruit that is most ripe, that is large, that is delicious, and spitting out those seeds and enhancing their opportunities for propagation. We have impacted that forest landscape. And it's maybe we go in and we pull out weeds and remove competitors from around the plants that we really like to use. And this is happening long before there's any domesticated plants. Humans have shaped any landscape they have been on. Our impacts have increased through time, and they have increased most dramatically since the end of the Pleistocene, the last ice age. So the Pleistocene ends, the environment is changing, the amount of carbon dioxide in the environment changes, the productivity of different plant species change, and humans are adapting to that novel environment. The Holocene introduces a great period of stabilization. It is a nice warm period that's been sticking around for a while, and that has allowed humans to diversify all the ways in which we make our living from the earth. And each new path that we take, every new innovation that we make has a subsequent impact on the environment that we live in. What we're seeing today is the accumulation of all of those impacts, and it is increasing at an exponential rate. So I'm in favor of this idea of sort of a Paleo-Anthropocene.
So it's clear that humans have significantly influenced the environment since arguably the beginning of their existence, but it seems that the Anthropocene, starting around the 1950s, is where human influence truly boomed. Let's now explore deeper into that topic to better understand what it's like to live within the Anthropocene.
One of the worst environmental disasters in American history.
These substances you see here could be putting their health at risk.
And the health department literally threw the health study on the floor.
Something there is being covered up.
The release of toxic waste into the ground.
People need to wake up.
How could they do this?
I had cancer. Neighbors around me all had cancer.
Can you tell me when I'm not going to lose any more children because one is already dead? Please tell me those things. That's what I wanted.
In addition to its proposal as the start of the Anthropocene, the 1950s also signified the beginning of the Great Acceleration, which is ongoing to this day. This period of rapid development is characterized by exponential growth in the global population, urbanization rates, socioeconomic activity, and technological advancement, while simultaneously increasing natural resource depletion, deforestation, pollution, land decimation, and wealth disparities. Worldwide, some efforts are being made to reverse the adverse impacts of Earth's industrialization through domestic policy, international agreements, and scientific collaboration, but are widely unacknowledged in the modern landscape. Our next guest on the podcast will help us learn about the philosophical understanding regarding human interactions with natural resources and the use of policies meant to govern and regulate those interactions in modern times.
My name is Fleischman. I teach environmental policy and governance at the University of Minnesota in the Department of Forest Resources. As you might imagine, since I'm in a Department of Forest Resources, a lot of my research focuses specifically on forests. I've worked all around the world, done research here in the US, in Minnesota, and in Texas, in Indiana. And I've also done research in India and Mexico. I came to this work because I really cared about forests and people.
I wanted to lay the foundation for the beginning of our discussion regarding environmental change and the precursors to massive environmental legislation and governments in the US. So, to start us off, could you tell us, after World War II ended and the troops came home, the 1950s became a time of rapid expansion. Could you explain the economic growth and upward social mobility of the 50s and 60s and how it led to major US environmental legislation that we still have in act today?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think there's a few variables at play. One important factor is that the scale of economic change in that period, the scale of industrialization, led to very significant and visible environmental harms that people became aware of. So a direct outcome of rapid economic growth was environmental degradation that was visible and negatively affected people's life. A second issue is that as people, I guess you could say, as people became more what we would call modern, as they became more attached to a scientific worldview, as they became more divorced from farming and natural resource exploitation of other kinds as a direct occupation, we can see around the world when this happens, there tends to be a transition in people's values from having a fairly utilitarian view of nature to having what I would call a somewhat more romantic view of nature, in which nature is seen as a little bit more separate from people's lives, but also something that's beautiful and needs to be protected. Whereas a more utilitarian view also often calls for protection, but often views protection as something that happens alongside use. I think those two currents come together to influence what you see then happening in the 1960s, which is the rise of large-scale political concern over environmental problems in the United States.
When thinking more about a utilitarian view of nature, the idea of possible resource exploitation may come to mind. When people view nature as something purely to benefit from, the fear is that people can become wasteful in the pursuit of some sort of gain, usually financial. This brings up the idea of the tragedy of the commons, which I know you're familiar with, and I'm wondering if you could describe for us.
Garrett Hardin published this essay, The Tragedy of the Commons, in 1968 in the journal Science. I read a few years ago that it was the second most cited article ever published in the scientific press, the most cited being The Structure of DNA by Watson and Crick. I don't know if that's still the case. This might have been 5 or 6 years ago. So this is an enormously influential work. And it's actually a fairly brief essay. It makes a couple main points, and so I want to separate them out. The first and most important point is Hardin talks about the idea that certain kinds of resources, when the use of those resources is open to everybody, and when everybody's use detracts from the availability of those resources will tend to be overexploited. And so he used the example of a pasture. And it's a very stylized example, but you could imagine a pasture in a village in medieval Europe. That's what he seems to be implying. Everyone has cows. The pasture isn't enough to support all of the cows. But because the pasture is open to everyone, they all graze their cows on the pasture and they overuse the pasture. And Hardin suggests that there are two kinds of solutions to this problem. The first kind of solution would be to privatize the pasture. So we could imagine dividing the pasture up between the households in the village. Each villager puts a fence around the part that's his or hers and grazes his or her cattle on only his or her part. The other option Hardin suggests is that we could have some entity of the state come in and say, well, folks, this pasture can support 20 cows. You can only put 20 cows on it. And so he uses the phrase mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon. So that's the main metaphor in the tragedy of the commons. And it's a very powerful metaphor because we can immediately recognize both situations in our everyday life that seem like a tragedy of the commons, as well as situations in environmental policy writ large that seem like a tragedy of the commons. So in everyday life, I always think about when I was a college student and I lived with several other people and we shared a kitchen and everyone would come and make their lunch and leave their dirty dishes in the sink. And then we didn't know whose fault it was and no one wanted to wash the dirty dishes. That was a tragedy of the commons.
Although he identified major issues in the progressing growth of mankind, Hardin's version of the tragedy was not without its flaws. From his perspective, all resources will inevitably be decimated because of the trend of exponential growth among populations. But what his theory failed to consider is the advancement of technological, agricultural, and resource management capabilities, arguments proposed by political economist and former mentor Dr. Fleischman, Dr. Eleanor Ostrom, in her 8 design principles on managing the commons. Could you describe Ostrom's ideas?
So to go back to the metaphor of the kitchen in my college house, we made a rule that said, wash your dishes before you put them in the sink. And if you don't have time to wash your dishes, you have to run to class. Okay, that's okay. Leave them in your room. Don't crowd up the kitchen with your dirty dishes. And then we kind of are around the kitchen. So once we made that rule, we kind of knew who wasn't following it. We'd kind of yell at the person, hey, you didn't wash your dishes. That's not nice. And we didn't have the problem anymore. So the key thing that Ostrom found at a broad level is when people can observe each other's behavior and communicate about it, they can often solve these problems, just like that. The challenge becomes when it's harder to observe and harder to communicate about that behavior. So thinking about fisheries, we've found that many small-scale inshore fisheries, so in the coast of Maine, people catch lobsters, and they have a relatively small boat. The lobsters live in relatively shallow water. So all the lobstermen are essentially working in sight of each other. They know what each other are doing. They live in the same community. And they're able to come up with rules on their own to manage their lobsters sustainably. And in fact, they have. But then when you think about hunting tuna, which are pelagic fish that live on the high seas and they move long distances, the fishermen don't even know who the other fishermen are who are hunting the tuna. And those are the kinds of fish that tend to be overexploited. The fishermen can't even communicate. So Ostrom came up with these 8 design principles. And I don't think I need to go into detail about all of them, But the
no need.
idea is where people can communicate, where they can solve conflicts, where the resources are visible to them and they understand how the resources are work, they're usually able to manage them sustainably. The risks are where people can't communicate, where people can't observe each other's behavior, where people don't understand the underlying dynamics of the system, or, and I think this is a very important one, where governments come in and undermine local arrangements for sustainable natural resource management.
So in a lot of these cases here where it's always some kind of outside influence. This is part of Ostrom's theory, and some kind of outside influence, government or financial, something just comes in and it starts exploiting either the resource or something near the resource, leading to kind of a rollover where eventually they expand into exploiting it. Do you think that there's an extent here, or do you believe that Dr. Ostrom would have seen an extent to where you can only go so far before you can stop some kind of corporate or financial entity from coming in and ruining things?
Well, one of the things that Ostrom believed very strongly was that when people have, and I think her research supports this, when people have more power and more agency and more ability to speak up for their needs, they are less likely to end up in these negative scenarios. So Ostrom believed very strongly that we should facilitate the ability of people to organize themselves. We should empower people to make their own rules. And we should support democratic governance. So we should support structures at a higher level that give people more power and more voice over their lives. And she believed that not that this will solve all problems, but sort of all else being equal, the more that people have these powers, the more they'll be able to resist changes that are bad for them. I just want to draw us back to Hardin. So Hardin believed that we needed sort of big, powerful entities to come in to solve our problems. And what Ostrom showed is in fact the opposite. When big, powerful entities come in and try to solve problems, they often screw things up a lot. What we need is empowering people to solve their problems. And that can often be very, very hard to do. And much of the work that I did with Ostrom and that Ostrom was doing in the wake of her early discoveries was in documenting how governments would try to, say, increase the power of local people over forest management. And it was hard to do because there were traditional powers that resisted those changes.
It's interesting that Ostrom is essentially arguing that there are many situations in which the people most affected by an issue should have more control over solving their problems, instead of large entities that may have good intentions but cannot adequately address those problems. While this is certainly true on many occasions, there are several instances that indicate the need for effective environmental governance and regulations in order to avoid environmental disaster. One such example was the case of Love Canal, New York, where schools and neighborhoods were built on top of a chemical dump site used in the 1950s. Residents weren't accurately informed of the land's original purpose, and only after discovering massive long-term health impacts from living above the toxic waste did a wave of environmental policies come to fruition in the 70s. How did massive and terrible events such as this one influence the development of environmental regulation during this time period?
Well, I think so. There were a whole bunch of events. And one of the interesting things, I've been fortunate to live in different parts of the United States. And you've mentioned the events that are most prominent in the national press. But there's also events that sort of, if you live in one place, everyone will talk about the environmental pollution or environmental health event that occurred in the Twin Cities here in North Minneapolis so all over the United States there were these very big prominent events which demonstrated to people that environmental pollution could cause severe risks to public health. And I think the burning of the Cuyahoga River was sort of an iconic example, but actually when I went to teach about it several years ago, I started looking for more details about it. And it turns out that many rivers had caught on fire in the 50s and 60s.
Many?
And so what you had in the late 1960s in the immediate aftermath was a nationwide consensus that we needed to do something to protect the environment, and we needed to do something to protect these particular kinds of environmental health harms that were very prominent. And this moment was so strong that nowadays we don't think of Republicans as being people who are very concerned about environmental protection. But President Nixon created the Environmental Protection Agency through an executive order. The EPA was created by President Nixon, and he created it because basically he was concerned that if he didn't do something, Congress would pass a law that would be even more strong. So he was in some sense trying to co-opt the moment, but he recognized we need to do something. And Congress in the late 1960s and early 1970s passed a whole host of environmental laws that the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act are probably the most well-known, the Endangered Species Act, the National Environmental Protection Act, and then a whole bunch of laws dealing with different aspects of toxic chemicals. There's a few different laws in there that basically said, first of all, we have the Environmental Protection Agency. The Environmental Protection Agency now has the authority to regulate, first of all, the release of different kinds of chemicals into water and into the air. And under that authority, the EPA has extensively regulated the extent to which businesses can release different kinds of harmful chemicals into the world. And then if you're not releasing them, you still have them. What are you going to do with them? And so the Superfund basically said, well, you have to clean them up if you have them. You have to take care of these. You can't just sort of dump them on the soil next to your factory. And so we've made great efforts in the US since then, following these laws, to clean up our atmosphere, to clean up our rivers, and to clean up these toxic waste sites. I want to say that this is a continuing problem. I mentioned that I work in India, and India is now going through a stage of rapid industrialization. And there are now rivers catching fire in India. And India is having a similar response where they're realizing, oh, we never needed to regulate the release of industrial waste, but now we need to do that. We need to create some laws. And to some extent, I don't want to exaggerate this, but to some extent, because there's a model in how the US has done this, and other countries, and Europe has done this, and many other countries have done this, and India is able to come here and to go to other countries and say, okay, let's look at what laws will work well for us.
So is there any form of environmental governance that stretches far enough that it can prevent something like Love Canal from happening again? Is there any way that we already know that no one's going to be able to dump and then build a school on top of it, of course, but what happens if this resurfaces, if another toxic waste dump has just completely been uncovered that no one knew about?
Well, I think in the US, we've gotten better at this because the EPA has had the authority now for a long time to regulate. They, in theory, they know where the factories are that are using toxic chemicals or what have you. And in theory, all those factories are registered. They have to keep track of where those chemicals are. In theory, those are being inspected regularly by EPA inspectors. And that process should mostly prevent things from bad things from happening. You probably don't think of this, but one of the major sources of toxic chemicals are dry cleaners. And I always found that kind of funny because, like, I don't know, there's a dry cleaning shop just on the corner here. It's like this little store, like how could it? But some of the chemicals they use are toxic. And and they're little shops, so they are regulated, but sometimes they fly under the radar.
Given all the evidence that points to the destructive effects of rapid human development since the 1950s, it begs the question whether an advanced human society will thrive within the Anthropocene at all. However, there is still hope. Growing awareness has resulted in the increased pressure of government responsibility, the expansion of environmental policies, the persisting regulations by federal agencies, and most importantly, the funding for research done by some of the professors of which you've just heard from. They all signify efforts towards a future of positive change.
As we round out the episode and our interviews, we wanted to give our guests the opportunity to share their final thoughts, particularly on what the mindset of humans should be as we live in the Anthropocene and witness drastic environmental change all around us. First, Dr. Thakar.
Well, as a completely biased human being, I have a great deal of interest in the success of our species. I'm not going to be around, but my children, great-grandchildren, and future generations will be. And if our species is going to survive, we first have to accept that we are significant climate drivers on the scale of other geologic forces. The things that we are doing today are impacting the environment in the same way that massive volcanic explosions all the way around the earth impacted the environment during the Permian, right? We are significant climate drivers. If we can accept that, then we can also become conscious, deliberate, thoughtful climate drivers. We can implement strategies that can help us improve our future. And I'm not talking about our distant future 1,000 years from now. I'm thinking about our very near future in the next 10 to 100 years, which is our greatest opportunity to be very conscious and critical about the way we can deliberately influence the Earth's climate. I think we can do that. Humans have this incredible capacity for adaptive behavior, collective action. And one of the key things I think that is interesting about the Great Acceleration is our incredible increase in collective learning. Globalization means that scientists all over the world can talk to each other within seconds. We can share information. Innovation has increased at a rate that I think can carry us through what is going to be happening in the future. But that only happens after we accept that we are, in fact, the major climate drivers affecting the world we live in today.
And do you think that understanding is coming about in the world today?
Scientists and the people who have access to this knowledge, and students and the folks who are learning to understand what is happening in the world, we still are very much talking to ourselves. We are significantly less effective at convincing the person on the airplane next to us about the truth of this reality, because it requires us to start at an initial base of understanding that, I may be left behind 15 or 20 years ago, and to take a step back and to guide somebody through gaining that understanding is something that's very difficult. So we have the people who spend their lives creating this knowledge that have a much more difficult time explaining it. And I have a very difficult time explaining this without using weird words that my brothers and sisters have never heard of. And so in my professional life, I say, yes, we are learning, we are going to do better. I think people's vision is changing. In my personal life, I go out into the community or I'm hanging out at a family gathering, and I'm not so sure that's happening. And I have to say that the failure is ours. The scientists, the policymakers, the people who could be pushing for change also need to be developing the skill sets to communicate the need for change to the broader audience.
Finally, Dr. Fleischman.
So building coalitions and organizing people, educating people, and bringing them on is crucial to enabling this to happen, both at the local, the regional, national, and even at the international level. So I'm cautiously optimistic about many of these issues, but it really depends on how effectively we organize and how we can build these coalitions that span these traditional identities.
Do you have anything to say to our listeners who are also cautiously optimistic?
Organize.
This concludes the first episode of Our Earth Rising. We want to give special thanks to our two guests, Dr. Heather Thakar and Dr. Forrest Fleischman, for agreeing to come onto the podcast. If you enjoyed listening to our conversation, we encourage you to share the podcast with your fellow Earthlings and consider leaving a review. Next episode, we will start our proper tour of Earth's ecospheres with discussions concerning the biosphere. Before we sign off, we would like to take this moment to plug our social media channels where you can receive updates about the podcast, learn more about our guests and their research, as well as explore deeper topics related to Earth's environment and ecospheres that we just cannot fit into one podcast episode. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter at Our Earth Rising, and on Instagram at Our Earth Rising Podcast.
As mentioned at the beginning of the episode, the Our Earth Rising podcast is created and produced by students and faculty at Texas A&M University. The speakers and interviewers for this episode were
Austin Bagan,
Bethany Miles,
and
Alyssa McCain.
The rest of the team for this episode includes Laura Gunn, Faiza Hassan, Alexia Hassan, Veronica Lynch-Taylor, Kirk Niekamp, Madison Sainez, Kristen Samuel, Matthew Shanks, Kendall Seitzman, and Bianca Zamora. I am the faculty mentor, Dr. Lindsay Sansom. Thanks for listening, and until next time, keep rising.